The ledger appeared on the district attorney's desk on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, wrapped in brown paper without a return address. Inside, columns of figures stretched across yellowed pages in cramped handwriting, each entry dated, each transaction coded with initials that meant nothing to the young prosecutor who first opened it. What caught his attention was the annotation scrawled in the margin of page 17. Payment received JM Trucking Contract, Revision 3rd Floor Storage. He cross-referenced the date with official town records. According to the Municipal Archive, no trucking contract had been revised that month. According to the official ledger housed in the town hall's vault, no payment had been received. According to this anonymous document, someone had been paid $12,000 for something that officially never happened. The town in question was unremarkable in the way many American municipalities were unremarkable in those years. Between the great conflicts, a place where industry had settled along the riverbanks, and neighborhoods had grown up around the factories in concentric rings of prosperity and decline. The old town hall stood at the center, a granite structure built during an age of civic optimism, with marble floors that echoed footsteps and wooden doors heavy enough to require both hands to open. By the time the ledger arrived at the prosecutor's office, the building had served the community for 70 years, housing the offices of mayors and clerks, the vaults where deeds and contracts were stored, the small courtrooms where minor disputes were settled before they reached the county level. It was the kind of place citizens trusted by instinct, where marriage licenses were filed and property transfers recorded, where the mundane machinery of civic life operated with the quiet authority of routine. The prosecutor who received the ledger was 3 years out of law school, ambitious enough to see opportunity in irregularity, but inexperienced enough not to understand what he was holding. He brought the ledger to his supervisor, who brought it to the county board, who quietly authorized a preliminary inquiry. The inquiry began with the most obvious question: whose handwriting filled those pages? A graphologist was brought in from the state capitol, a retired police investigator who had spent decades examining forged checks and fraudulent documents. He studied the script for 2 days before delivering his assessment. The handwriting belonged to someone trained in bookkeeping, someone who had learned penmanship in the old style, before typewriters replaced longhand in official record-keeping. The ink was standard municipal issue, the kind ordered in bulk by government offices. The paper itself was unremarkable except for one detail. It bore a watermark used exclusively by a single paper mill that supplied municipal offices throughout the region during a specific 6-year period 3 decades earlier. The investigators began with property records, pulling files for commercial transactions during the years covered by the mysterious ledger. They worked backward from addresses, comparing official documentation with the coded entries. A pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical solution. Parcels of land had been rezoned without public hearings. Contracts had been awarded to companies whose incorporation papers were filed just weeks before the bids were accepted. Buildings had been condemned and demolished, their lots sold to developers whose names appeared nowhere in business directories, but whose initials matched those scattered through the anonymous ledger. The official town records told one story. The ledger told another. Between them lay a third narrative, one that had to be reconstructed from silences and gaps and the careful absence of documentation. The town clerk during those years had been a man named Richter, appointed to the position after serving as deputy clerk for nearly 2 decades. Those who remembered him described a cautious individual, methodical in his work, the sort who arrived early and stayed late, whose desk was always organized, whose files were maintained with obsessive precision. He had lived alone in a modest house on the north side, walked to work each morning regardless of weather, ate lunch at his desk, and departed each evening at precisely 5:30. His salary, recorded in municipal budgets, was $1,500 annually, later raised to $1,800. His expenses, based on tax records that survived, were minimal. Yet when he died, suddenly, of what the death certificate listed as heart failure at age 53, his estate included a summer cottage on the lake, municipal bonds worth $40,000, and a safety deposit box containing bearer bonds issued by companies that had ceased to exist. The safety deposit box had been opened as part of a state settlement, its contents cataloged by a bank officer who noticed nothing unusual at the time. Bearer bonds were common instruments then, negotiable without registration, designed to evade taxation by those who knew how to use them. The companies that had issued them were real enough, or had been real. Construction firms, trucking operations, warehouse management companies. They had addresses in the business district, telephone listings, stationery with embossed letterheads. They had also ceased operations within months of the bond issuances, leaving no forwarding addresses, no dissolution papers, no trace beyond what was required to establish legitimacy long enough for whatever purpose they served. The investigators found something else in the estate records: regular deposits to Richter's bank account, amounts ranging from $200 to $1,000, arriving every few months with no source noted beyond transfer. The bank, when questioned decades later, could provide no additional information. Electronic records did not exist. Paper trails had been destroyed after the required retention period. The deposits themselves proved nothing except that money had arrived and Richter had not questioned its origin publicly. But when those amounts were added together and compared to the entries in the anonymous ledger, correlations appeared. Not exact matches, that would have been too obvious, but patterns that suggested a simple system. Someone kept track of payments received, and someone else ensured those payments never appeared in official records. The mechanism, when reconstructed, possessed an elegant simplicity that investigators recognized from other cases of municipal corruption. The town clerk controlled access to official records. He decided what was filed and where, what was cross-referenced, and what remained isolated in manila folders that might sit untouched for years. A developer seeking rezoning would submit the official application, pay the official fee, attend the required public hearing. Simultaneously, through intermediaries careful never to leave paper trails, additional payments would be made to ensure favorable outcomes. The official process provided cover. The unofficial payments provided certainty. Nothing was written down that connected the two streams of activity. The rezoning was granted based on stated reasons: economic development, housing needs, commercial opportunity, while the actual mechanism remained invisible. Richter's role was not to participate in negotiations or receive payments directly. His value lay in his position at the intersection of information flows. Applications crossed his desk. He could delay processing them, losing files in the bureaucratic machinery until conditions were met elsewhere. He could schedule hearings at inconvenient times when opposition might be minimal. He could ensure that certain documents were filed in locations where they would be difficult to find, buried in folders labeled with deliberately vague descriptions. Most importantly, he controlled the ledgers where transactions were officially recorded. A payment could be received and deposited without appearing in municipal accounts. A contract could be modified without the revision being noted in the official record. Property could change hands with deed transfers recorded in ways that obscured the actual parties involved. The system required others, of course. Richter was meticulous, but not creative. Someone designed the structure he maintained. Someone decided which developments would be approved and which denied. Someone collected the unofficial payments and distributed them through channels that left minimal traces. The investigators found evidence of meetings, reconstructed from appointment calendars and witness statements given decades after the fact. A particular restaurant near the courthouse, now closed, appeared repeatedly in these accounts. Certain tables in the back, away from windows, where men in good suits met over lunch or dinner, their conversations lost to time, but their presence remembered by waitstaff who noticed the quality of the tips and the tension in the body language. One figure appeared repeatedly in these reconstructions, though always at a remove, never directly connected to transactions, but present in the background of events. He had arrived in town during the years before Richter's appointment, establishing himself through a trucking company that secured municipal contracts for waste removal and materials transport. The company was legitimate, its operations visible and ordinary. Behind it, investigators later suspected, lay connections to networks that controlled labor unions, construction supply chains, and the informal economy that existed parallel to official commerce. This man was not crude in his methods. He did not threaten or intimidate visibly. Instead, he offered opportunities. A favorable contract here, a recommendation there, introductions to people who could help with financing or labor or permits. The favors accumulated, the obligations grew. By the time anyone realized they were compromised, extraction had become impossible without exposing their own participation. The pattern was recognizable to investigators familiar with organized crime's infiltration of legitimate institutions. The approach was patient, building relationships over years, creating dependencies that felt voluntary until the moment they became constraints. A contractor who accepted help securing a project found himself expected to hire specific subcontractors. A politician who benefited from campaign contributions discovered those contributions came with expectations about appointments and decisions. A clerk who accepted a modest payment for expediting a filing learned that one payment led to expectations of others, that refusal meant exposure, that silence was the price of security. The system sustained itself through mutual compromise, each participant bound by their own actions, unable to expose others without implicating themselves. The anonymous ledger represented a vulnerability in this system, evidence that should never have existed. Organized crime's strength lay in oral agreements and unspoken understandings, business conducted through layers of intermediaries who knew only fragments of larger operations. Written records created risks. They could be discovered, analyzed, used as evidence. The existence of the ledger suggested someone had broken protocol, perhaps kept it as insurance, or perhaps simply failed to understand the danger documentation represented. When it appeared on the prosecutor's desk 3 decades later, it arrived with no explanation. The envelope bore no fingerprints. The postmark indicated only that it had been mailed from within the state. Someone had kept it hidden for years, then chose to send it forward, perhaps motivated by conscience or revenge or calculation that remained mysterious. The investigation expanded slowly, constrained by the passage of time and the death of key figures. Richter was gone. The man with the trucking company had left town years earlier, his current whereabouts unknown. Others who might have provided testimony were elderly, their memories uncertain, their willingness to speak compromised by old fears, and the practical consideration that admitting knowledge of corruption might implicate them in it. The investigators worked with fragments, property records that showed suspicious patterns, bank statements that revealed unexplained deposits, architectural drawings that documented buildings demolished and reconstructed in ways that suggested advanced knowledge of zoning changes. What emerged was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, but rather a diffuse network of small corruptions that reinforced each other. A building inspector who could be convinced to overlook code violations. A planning commissioner whose vote could be predicted based on who employed his son-in-law. A mayor who understood that certain projects required cooperation and certain questions should not be asked too publicly. None of these individuals saw themselves as criminals. They rationalized their actions as practical accommodations to how things worked. Necessary flexibility in a rigid system, harmless shortcuts that hurt no one directly. The fact that these small corruptions enabled larger operations, that they provided cover for criminal networks to launder money through legitimate projects and establish control over municipal decision-making, was something they chose not to examine too closely. The financial mechanics were sophisticated for their time. Money flowed through legitimate businesses, construction firms, supply companies, real estate holdings, mixing clean revenue with dirty capital until the sources became indistinguishable. A trucking company that performed actual work for the municipality could invoice for services rendered and additional services that existed only on paper. The invoices were processed through normal channels, paid from municipal budgets, documented in ways that appeared routine. The excess amounts were distributed through informal channels, reaching their ultimate destinations without direct connections that could be traced. Some portion returned to the municipal officials who facilitated the process. Some went to the intermediaries who managed the logistics. Some flowed back to the criminal networks that provided the original capital and expected returns on their investments. The beauty of the system, from the perspective of those who designed it, was its resilience. No single point of failure could bring it down. If one official became uncomfortable or threatened exposure, they could be replaced. If one business became subject to scrutiny, it could be dissolved and its operations transferred to new entities with new names. The structure was modular, each component potentially disposable, the whole designed to survive the loss of any part. This architectural approach to corruption reflected sophistication uncommon in simple bribery schemes. It suggested planning by individuals who understood organizational theory, who had studied how legitimate businesses distributed risk and responsibility, who applied those principles to illegal operations with careful attention to sustainability. The investigators found evidence of this careful design in the timing of events. Contracts were awarded just before budget years ended, when fiscal pressures created incentives to spend allocated funds. Rezonings occurred during summer months when public attention waned and attendance at hearings dropped. Changes to building codes were introduced as technical amendments to larger ordinances, buried in language that required expertise to understand. The pattern demonstrated knowledge of bureaucratic rhythms and psychological tendencies, suggesting someone who had studied not just how municipal government worked in theory, but how it functioned in practice, where its vulnerabilities lay, which pressure points could be exploited with minimal risk. One particular case illustrated the method's elegance. A warehouse district near the river had been zoned for industrial use for decades, its buildings occupied by small manufacturers and storage operations. Property values were modest, reflecting the area's functional rather than prestigious character. Then, over the course of 18 months, a series of apparently unrelated events occurred. A new highway was announced, its route placing an interchange within a mile of the warehouse district. Environmental regulations were updated, making the older industrial operations more expensive to maintain. Insurance rates increased, justified by claims of increased fire risk in aging buildings. Several property owners, facing mounting costs and uncertain futures, sold their holdings to buyers whose names appeared in real estate records but nowhere else. The transactions were legitimate in form, recorded properly, taxed appropriately. 2 years later, the zoning for the district was changed to mixed commercial and residential use. The change was justified by declining industrial employment and the need for housing near the new highway interchange. The public hearings drew minimal opposition. Most of the previous owners had already departed, and the new owners uniformly supported the rezoning. Shortly afterward, demolition permits were issued. The old warehouses came down. New construction began. The property values multiplied. The entities that had purchased the land at industrial valuations sold it at commercial prices to developers who built retail spaces and apartment complexes. The capital gains were substantial. The tax liabilities were managed through strategies that were legal, if aggressive. None of the transactions appeared improper when examined individually. The pattern only became visible when viewed as a sequence, and even then required suspecting coordination that could not be proven from public records alone. The anonymous ledger contained entries that corresponded to dates during this sequence. Payments marked with initials that might have referred to building inspectors, zoning board members, or the engineers who certified the environmental assessments. The amounts varied but followed a logic. Larger payments for key decisions, smaller amounts for routine approvals, bonuses when projects reached completion milestones. The system resembled corporate incentive structures, performance-based compensation applied to corruption. This business-like approach distinguished sophisticated operations from crude bribery. It created stakeholder alignment, ensuring everyone involved had reasons to maintain the structure and protect its secrecy. The psychological dimension fascinated investigators who had studied organized crime's institutional infiltration in other contexts. The criminals who designed these systems understood human nature with the precision of sociologists. They identified individuals susceptible to compromise not through weakness, but through ambition or need, or the simple desire to be helpful. They offered assistance that seemed reasonable, even generous. They built relationships slowly, establishing trust before introducing moral ambiguity. By the time the compromised individual recognized they had crossed ethical lines, retreat had become impossible without costs that exceeded continued cooperation. The trap was psychological, built from the target's own choices, maintained by their own rationalizations. Richter exemplified this pattern. His appointment as town clerk came after years of competent service as deputy, earned through reliability and attention to detail. He was not corrupt by nature, accounts suggested. He was cautious, rule-following, the sort who found security in procedure. But he was also underpaid, living on a salary that barely kept pace with inflation, watching others prosper while his own advancement stalled at the ceiling imposed by municipal budgets. When someone offered to supplement his income in exchange for small accommodations, processing certain applications more quickly, ensuring certain documents were filed in particular ways, the compromise seemed minor, even justified given his years of underpaid service. The first payment was modest enough to rationalize. The second came more easily. By the time the amounts grew substantial, refusal meant exposing his previous acceptances. The trap closed gradually, each step forward making retreat more costly until continuing felt like the only viable option. The investigation revealed how thoroughly this psychological manipulation had been applied. A planning commissioner, interviewed decades later under immunity, described how his involvement began with a request to meet a developer socially, just to hear their perspective on a pending project. The meeting occurred at a restaurant, casual and friendly. The developer mentioned during conversation that the commissioner's son was applying to colleges, expressed admiration for the young man's potential, offered to write a recommendation letter given his connections in the business community. The offer was framed as mentorship, assistance between acquaintances. When the commissioner voted to approve the developer's project, no explicit connection existed. When the son was accepted to his preferred school with a scholarship from a foundation the developer helped fund, gratitude felt natural. When the commissioner was asked to support another project months later, declining seemed ungrateful. The relationship evolved into obligation without ever being stated as transaction. This sophisticated approach to corruption required patience and resources that distinguished organized criminal networks from individual operators. A lone bribery attempt might be clumsy, easily detected, vulnerable to exposure if the target refused. A systematic infiltration campaign could afford failures, learning from rejection, adjusting approach, trying different angles until finding the leverage that worked. The networks had time and money and experience accumulated across multiple cities and decades. They understood that municipal corruption was not about controlling everyone, but rather identifying the critical decision points and ensuring the right individuals occupied those positions or could be influenced when necessary. The town hall itself became a physical manifestation of this infiltration. On the surface, it functioned normally, providing the services citizens expected, maintaining the appearance of civic order. Beneath that surface, parallel processes operated, invisible to those who interacted with the institution only through its legitimate functions. Contractors who paid unofficial fees received permits processed quickly. Developers who worked through approved channels found their projects reviewed more favorably than those who did not. Citizens who sought services without understanding the hidden structures received standard treatment. Their interactions with municipal government unremarkable. The corruption was targeted and selective, designed not to disrupt the institution's legitimate functions, but to exploit them for additional profit. The storage room on the third floor, mentioned in the anonymous ledger's margin note, became central to the investigation's later phases. According to official building records, the room served as general storage for archived documents, a mundane space filled with filing cabinets and boxes. Access was controlled by the clerk's office, with keys issued only to designated staff. When investigators finally examined the room decades after the events in question, they found it substantially larger than building plans indicated. A false wall, constructed with careful attention to matching materials and finishes, concealed an additional space. Behind the wall, they discovered filing cabinets containing duplicates of official documents, but versions that differed from those in the municipal vault. Contracts with altered terms. Property transfers with different parties named. Financial records showing payments that had no corresponding entries in official ledgers. The discovery validated the anonymous ledger's accuracy while raising new questions. Why maintain duplicate records that contradicted official versions? The answer, investigators concluded, was insurance and control. The hidden documents provided evidence that could expose the entire system, giving whoever controlled them leverage over participants. If a corrupt official threatened to confess or demanded larger payments, the documents could implicate them while protecting the network's leadership. If a developer attempted to renegotiate terms, proof of their initial participation in illegal transactions could enforce compliance. The hidden archive was simultaneously evidence of crimes and insurance against betrayal, a mechanism that reinforced the system's stability by ensuring mutual vulnerability. How long the hidden archive existed before its discovery remained uncertain. The construction of the false wall appeared consistent with work done during a building renovation 20 years before the investigation began, suggesting the space had been planned and built as part of the infiltration system rather than created hastily to conceal evidence. This timeline implied remarkable confidence and long-term thinking. Someone had understood decades earlier that corruption of this scale would generate documentation that might become valuable or dangerous, and had prepared secure storage integrated into the institution itself. The audacity of hiding evidence within the building it implicated reflected either enormous arrogance or sophisticated risk calculation, possibly both. The investigation eventually stalled, its findings sufficient to confirm corruption had occurred, but insufficient to prosecute given the passage of time and the death or disappearance of key figures. The anonymous ledger, the hidden documents, the reconstructed transactions all demonstrated that official records had been manipulated and municipal decisions corrupted. But proving who ordered these manipulations, who profited beyond what could be established through circumstantial evidence, required testimony from participants willing to implicate themselves. The compromised officials who survived were elderly, their memories conveniently vague about details, their knowledge limited to their specific roles. The criminal networks that had operated behind the corruption had long since shifted operations to other jurisdictions or evolved into legitimate businesses that bore no obvious connection to past activities. The final report, when filed with the county board, documented what could be proven: systematic corruption in municipal records, evidence of bribery and illicit payments, manipulation of zoning and contracting processes. It recommended reforms, enhanced oversight of record-keeping, separation of duties to prevent concentration of authority, regular audits by external examiners. These recommendations were implemented, strengthening safeguards against future corruption. The individuals implicated, who remained alive, faced no criminal charges. Statutes of limitation had expired, evidence was decades old, proof beyond reasonable doubt unattainable. Some resigned from whatever positions they still held. Others continued in their roles, their reputations damaged but not destroyed, the accusations serious but not proven to legal certainty. The town itself absorbed the scandal with mixed reactions. Some citizens expressed outrage, demanding accountability that could no longer be delivered. Others were unsurprised, their cynicism about municipal government confirmed. Still others questioned whether the investigation itself was justified, whether digging up past corruption served any purpose beyond damaging the community's reputation. The town hall continued to function, its compromised history becoming part of its institutional memory, mentioned occasionally, but no longer the focus of public attention. The building's third-floor storage room was renovated, the false wall removed, the space converted to modern office use. The filing cabinets and their contradictory documents were preserved as evidence, then archived in secure storage where they would remain available for historical research, but removed from daily awareness. Years later, a historian studying municipal corruption would examine these materials and find in them confirmation of patterns documented elsewhere. How organized crime infiltrated legitimate institutions through patient relationship building. How corruption operated through selective exploitation rather than wholesale takeover. How systems of mutual compromise bound participants together. How evidence was both created and controlled to serve insurance rather than accountability purposes. The town hall's case provided a detailed example of mechanics that had been replicated in dozens of cities, a template that demonstrated both the sophistication of infiltration techniques and the vulnerabilities in municipal governance that made such infiltration possible. What the historian could not definitively determine was the ultimate source of the anonymous ledger. Among the papers preserved in the investigation's files was a letter received months after the initial inquiry concluded, typed on unidentifiable paper with no signature. The letter claimed the ledger had been removed from the hidden storage room years earlier by someone who had access but grew troubled by their complicity. According to this account, the individual had kept the ledger hidden, uncertain what to do with it, fearing exposure if they came forward, but disturbed by allowing the corruption to remain secret. Eventually, age and declining health prompted them to send the ledger forward, choosing to let others decide its significance while maintaining their own anonymity. The letter provided no identifying details, no way to verify its claims. It might have been truthful confession or deliberate misdirection. Like much about the case, certainty remained elusive, leaving only the evidence of systematic corruption and the haunting question of how many other institutions might house similar secrets hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to look carefully at records that don't quite match what they claim to document. The granite building still stands at the center of town. Its marble floors still echo footsteps. Its wooden doors still require 2 hands to open. Citizens continue to file marriage licenses and property transfers there, conducting the mundane business of civic life with whatever trust remains after scandal has passed. The storage room on the 3rd floor is now filled with modern filing systems and ergonomic furniture. The walls are solid, containing no hidden spaces. The safeguards implemented after the investigation make certain kinds of corruption more difficult, though those who study these patterns understand that determined infiltration always finds new methods, exploiting whatever vulnerabilities exist in any given moment. The town hall serves its community, functions normally, maintains its institutional dignity. But those who know its history see it differently now, aware that services can conceal depths, that official records can mask unofficial transactions, that trust in institutions must be paired with vigilance about how that trust might be exploited by those patient enough to play long games with other people's faith in civic order.